Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise tonight on the subject of Bill C-31, one that's meant to help address the affordability of day-to-day life for Canadians. I want to start with what I've done often in speeches like this, which is with what I appreciate about what's in this bill. And that is that we see the beginnings of a dental care program in it. When I knock on doors in my community, as I have for the last 4 years, and I ask my neighbours what's most important to them, so often I hear some variation of an interest in truly universal health care, from mental health to eye care to, yes, dental care as well. And in this bill, there is a proposal for an interim dental benefit for children under the age of 12, for those without dental coverage already with an income of less than $90,000 in their household, providing their parents or guardians with upfront tax-free funds to cover dental expenses eligible back to October 1st of this year. And if this House passes Bill C-31, it would provide payments of up to $650 per child. This is an important, necessary measure, and it's being proposed because it's been prioritized by this House, specifically in the supply and confidence agreement between the governing party and the NDP. Now, that being said, to me it's unfortunate that there are some items like funding the Canada Disability Benefit that aren't there and so aren't being similarly prioritized, while there's also other items in this same agreement that just aren't being followed altogether. For example, addressing the climate crisis through, quote, early moves to phase out fossil fuel subsidies through public financing, when in fact what we're actually seeing is that in this year's budget a new fossil fuel subsidy is being introduced. It's a tax credit for an unproven technology called carbon capture and storage to the tune of $8.6 billion a year. But what is encouraging, what I'm glad for to see in this bill, is to see parliamentarians working together for what's in the best interest of Canadians across the country, and dental care is a critical part of that. The second part of this bill is, in my view, a missed opportunity. There's a $500 rental housing benefit being proposed in the bill. And as is the case in many communities across the country, in mine, in Kitchener, the average rent is around $1,725 a month. This benefit is a drop in the bucket in the midst of a crisis, and really more importantly, though, is it doesn't address the root cause of this crisis. And so I'd like to suggest that we start by naming and being clear that this is a housing crisis that we're in across the country. And I guess as I do that, I want to also help my colleagues understand what that looks like in my community specifically. In the last 3 years, there's a lot of parliamentarians in this place who like talking about things that have tripled. It's a dubious claim, but this one's actually quite accurate. The homeless population in Waterloo region has tripled from just over 300 to over 1,000 people who are living unsheltered. Those are members of my community that we are collectively letting down. Homes continue to become increasingly unaffordable. You can, as I mentioned, rent earlier. You can talk about house prices also. Since 2005, house prices have gone up 275%, when wages have increased a meager 42%. What does that mean? It means that back then, house prices were 3 times more than average annual income. Today, it's 8 times more than average annual income. That means that for a young person in my community, buying a home isn't even an option, and increasingly renting one isn't either. For those who are on the wait list for affordable housing, for a 1-bedroom unit, that wait list is now almost 8 years. And so it's obvious that all levels of government, the federal government included, need to meaningfully address this crisis. The federal government, in my view, has 2 ways of doing this. One is recognizing that the federal government has the largest budget of any level. It's why I'm glad that in this year's budget we did see $1.5 billion in a re-upping of the Rapid Housing Initiative and another $1.5 billion for co-op housing, getting us closer to where co-op housing, for example, used to be funded at. I'd encourage the governing party to ensure that this money is spent and in future budgets we get closer back to where those funding levels were. the federal government, of course, also sets the market conditions. And this is where this conversation about, oh, it's just supply and demand, well, that's not totally true. It's supply and demand within the conditions that government sets. Homes should be places that people live and not commodities for investors to trade. If some corporate investor wants to make a bunch of money, I'd encourage them to go invest in the stock market and don't do it in the backs of young people and other low-income folks in my community. The governing party could fix this by removing incentives for corporate landlords to treat our housing market like the stock market. I'll give you an example. I was speaking with Omar in my community last week. He's lucky. His rent is a fairly reasonable amount. And so the institutional investor that owns the apartment building that he's in recently painted the exterior of the building, and then he saw the rental notices coming in, slowly saying increase after increase, beyond what the Ontario guideline is, demanding that he pay for these increases with interest on top. Now, Omar is lucky in that he knows that this is not appropriate. He knows that this is a bullying tactic by his landlord, but all the same, there's a level of anxiety when he gets that notice in the mail saying there's interest due on top. But he knows what the landlord's really doing, trying to bully him to leave so that when he does, they jack up the rents. This is what we're seeing in communities across the country, and in this place, we have a role to play to address it. One example of these institutional landlords are real estate investment trusts. They've grown from their ownership portfolio. In 1996, they didn't own any rental suites across the country. Today, it's nearly 200,000. In fact, institutional investors across the country today own between 20 to 30% of our country's purpose-built rental housing stock. We don't know exactly how much because another issue is that we don't have proper disclosures on those who own from these corporate investors in our real estate market and in our homes. But we do know that they're in housing not for what they can contribute, but for what they can take out of it, which is the largest return possible. It's the reason why I've introduced Motion 71 on the floor of this House, which would call for simply taxing real estate investment trusts, one type of corporate investor, at the regular corporate tax rate, an exemption which they currently enjoy, which currently tilts the market in their favor. And if we did that, well, that's a new revenue that we could then use to invest in the affordable housing that I'm pretty sure almost every parliamentarian in this place claims to want to see more built. Well, one way to build more of it is to ensure that large corporate investors are paying their fair share, using those revenues to then build that housing. And in fact, it was a Conservative finance minister back in 2006 who began to remove some of these exemptions from taxes from various income trusts. And I'd encourage the governing party to simply take the text of this motion and put it in the fall economic statement. Put it in Budget 2023. In fact, you can announce it tomorrow if you'd like. Not you, Madam Speaker, but the governing party, of course, to ensure that we address the fact that homes should be places for people to live and not commodities for investors to trade. And we'll often hear the fact that, oh, we need to do more studies. Well, good news, the studies have already been done. The shift directives have called for this removal of a tax exemption for real estate investment trusts. The Office of the Federal Housing Advocate has called for the same, written by a researcher from the University of Waterloo, Martine August, and the Social Development Centre of Waterloo Region in my community as well. From local to national groups, there's a unified voice that this is a reasonable measure to meaningfully begin to address the commodification of housing. And so in conclusion, as is the case for my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands, I'll be proudly supporting this legislation. It includes important measures that go in the right direction. But if the governing party is serious about addressing the housing crisis, I'd encourage them to demonstrate it through more meaningful legislative action. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Thank you
Much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for what I think is a very important intervention at this time when the cost of living is so critical for Canadians. I just want to give a word of advice, a comment, let's call it, related to the fact that we can do multiple things at once. The member speaks about the need to make sure that we can tackle the real estate investment trusts that are ravaging low-income communities, including my own in Edmonton-Griesbach. But what I also want to make mention is that when we're talking about dental care and when we're talking about getting support to young Canadians, 500,000 of them, would the member please elaborate on the fact that this benefit is going to have such immense benefit to the people in his community and the children in particular? Would he talk about how dental care is going to change and realize the lives of so many children in his riding?
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Absolutely. It's the reason why I started my speech with exactly that. I think it's important that we work towards a sense of what is the common ground in this place. And what I appreciate about what's in this bill is that this is moving towards dental care, that I know I've heard the member for Edmonton-Griesbach speak about how important that is for his community, and it is for mine also. And it's an important measure that is only happening as a result of collaboration from parliamentarians in this place. But what's also true is that this is a missed opportunity, that a $500 benefit is not going to meaningfully address the housing crisis, and there's an opportunity for the governing party to go much further here.
And comments, the honourable member for King's Hands.
Honourable colleague for his remarks tonight. And look, I agree with a lot of what he had to say, so I'll go back to one of the points where we might disagree, but I'll ask the question in a reasonable manner. He mentioned about the budget of 2022 that included incentives for carbon capture. And I know that he and I would differ on our ideology and our vision about the transition towards a low-carbon economy. I think Canadian oil and gas is still going to need to play an important role in the days ahead, particularly after the war in Ukraine that is continuing. We've talked about trading or changing geopolitical patterns from a trade perspective. Just recently, actually, oil and gas companies have announced $25 billion worth of investments in this. I take notice it's not the only technology that should be driven forward, but notwithstanding he may not completely agree with it, does he at least recognize this is important change from the private sector that the government is helping to enhance amongst the other measures that we're pursuing?
For Kitchener Centre.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for King's Hands. I think if we had more questions addressed in the way he just did, I think this place would be a much more productive place. Because he's right, we don't agree about this, and we've spoken about this in this House before. But the reason we don't agree isn't ideology, it's science. We are in a climate emergency. And as a result, it's my view and that of many advocates across the country that this is not a time to be giving oil and gas companies more money to invest in unproven technologies. Rather, let's give it to homeowners and workers across the country to invest in the proven solutions that we already know. Another way to put it is if the oil and gas industry thinks carbon capture is so great, go invest in it yourself. But don't take $8.6 billion of taxpayer money to do it.
We have time for a brief question. The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I very much appreciated my colleague's speech. It was very well researched, thorough. He's very close to his constituents and his community. It's always nice to hear from members who know their community so well. Here's my question, Madam Speaker. In the past, the federal government had more social programs. For example, there was a program for the homeless. The federal government funded it for a few years, then all of a sudden changed the rules of the game and just stepped out. And who ended up paying for that program and other programs? Provinces. Isn't the colleague worried that we are getting into a huge program without the province's agreement, and then that Canada might, that Ottawa might disengage and leaving the provinces to deal with it? A brief reply, Kitchener Centre. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In my opinion, it is important that all levels of government work together with all the tools that they have. That's why I support this bill. I support it because I appreciate that the federal level of government has a role to play in healthcare. Thank you.
Resuming the